So to summarize, before we move on, our expectations for a nation-state is that the members of that very defined geographic territory will all see themselves as members of a particular community, the nation, and that members of a particular nation should be grouped together in one state, which of course would need a territory, a homeland. And the construction, the ideological construction of that nation, almost always requires a reinterpretation or invention, if not outright falsification, of that common history. At any rate, there was no one starting point for the nation-state, and so we're better off considering Westphalia and some of the important points we're going to talk about in the next part of the video as just signposts in our road towards the modern nation-state. As you probably know, in the mid-1700s, what's sometimes called the Industrial Revolution, and the creation of something similar to what we think of as modern capitalism. That industrialization made it possible to produce the same amount of agricultural material, same amount of crops, with many, many fewer workers. And it also created a need for workers in newly developing industrial cities. And that meant that large numbers of people who had formerly lived on the land, in some cases they've been legally required to do so, moved to these industrial cities. Weakened and eventually destroyed the traditional feudal sources of authority which had given that society its stability. The new ideology of nationalism was one of the few things that could unite a diverse group of industrial workers recently moved from all over the country. Not only is nationalism a new idea in this time period, but the whole idea, the whole concept of having a core identity is brand new. In a feudal economy where almost everybody was the same religion, where almost everybody worked the land in the same fashion that their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents did, the very notion of identity was meaningless. Let's look at one final major signpost in the creation of nationalism and the nation-state, the French Revolution. When the French overthrew and ultimately beheaded their king, this was seen as quite threatening by the crowned heads of many other European countries. And depending on your perspective, either several of them decided to combine to try and bring the French revolutionaries to heel, or the French decided to make war in order to set up sister republics and spread the revolution through Europe. So how did France prevail against the combined forces of Britain, Holland, Austria, Prussia, Italy, and Spain? The answer, to oversimplify only a little, was they invented modern nationalism. We're used to the tragically huge scale of fighting in modern wars. In World War II, the U.S. alone had more than 12 million soldiers. The Soviet Union had more. But pre-modern wars featured militaries that were far smaller. Wars up until this moment had been fought by small numbers of professional troops. What became the French national anthem, the Marseillaise. In addition to being a fairly bloodthirsty signpost along the road to nationalism, as national anthems were, actually tells the story of what happened pretty well. The first verse exhorts French people to rise up and defend France
against a horde of conspiratorial kings who planned to roll back the reforms of the French Revolution. Well, it's probably the disturbing line, "Let their impure blood water our fields," that draws our attention first. It's actually the first part of this section that describes so well what happened. "Tremble, tyrants, everyone is a soldier to combat you. To arms, citizens." Revolutionary France instituted what was probably the first mass conscription ever. It was assumed that all men 18 to 25
would enlist in the army to defend the revolution and defend France. There was plenty of resistance to conscription.
Still, the results were quite impressive.
The largest previous French army, which was probably the largest in European history previous to this point, was about 150,000 people. The French Revolutionary Army was 10 times as big.
The French state's administrative capacity had lagged behind the development of its army.
But there's no doubt that the revolutionary French military was huge.
One of the reasons the famous French general Napoleon was so successful is that he was one of the first to devise tactics appropriate for much larger armies of relatively untrained troops. The result? This large army, under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, prevailed against the combined might of much of Europe.
By the end of this period, Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. By the end of these wars, these soldiers were not fighting for the revolution, for liberté, fraternité, and égalité, equality. They were fighting for France.
Since then, of course, we have seen a continued expansion of the power of nation-states, often, though not always, hand in hand with an extension of political rights. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this phenomenon in the discussion forum.